Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Call from 2020. So, we have a girl named Sung-ryung who is in the future. She, of course, is in the 2020 future and is to all of a sudden go home one day to install her landline to find out that she is going to connect to a girl named Jong-seo who is to be in the 90s. And so with that, we have Jung-seo, who is to be consistently tortured by her mother, given food that, of course, to look like dirt and is to look like a plant. And so we go into this story and have Sung-ryung, who is trying to help Jung-seo by giving her future knowledge about certain bands that she is to go on and like, and it seems that eventually Jung-seo is to repay Sung-ryung by helping Sung-ryung in the past, a younger version of herself, trying to prevent certain accidents, trying to go on and help her. And then when Sung-ryung is to eventually have her future turn out much more better than she could have hoped, Sung-ryung then goes on and is to start to forget about Jung-seo because she is too busy. She is wrapped up with a number of things. And all of a sudden, Jung-seo is to start to go on and get irritated because of that. And by the time that Sung-ryung is to step in and try and save Jung-seo's life, we then have Jung-seo where things have started to build for far too long, and Jung-seo goes on to eventually find out why exactly her mother is to go on and torture and hurt her consistently. And then Jung-seo, I guess, cannot fight her own fate. So we go into a much more interesting story. Eventually that's where this all tends to lead at some point. And I found this movie to be very interesting. Giving us like a Dennis Quaid kind of frequency kind of movie. And I thought that was kind of an interesting idea, because eventually Frequency went on and was like a movie, and then it became a show. And so really when you go on and you are a person from the future who is talking to someone from the past, realize you need to go on and you need to be able to trust the person in the past, because they can go on and destroy what is to be eventually your future. So, yeah, so if you're not going to be like Dennis Quaid's son in the movie Frequency telling his son some future knowledge, and the dad's not going to do much with that, then eventually, like, that is to be like the perfect way about going about things. But when you go on, you have other different variations, things start to get a little bit more sketchy. So, with that said, this movie, if I didn't say it already, this movie is currently available on Netflix. So, with that said, I think it's about that time to just go and try and double five this bad boy up. I try to be as much vague as I could about this review because I had to. Because if I were to go on and start telling what is actually to go on in this movie, feels like I'm kind of giving it away. So, with that said, I'm going to go on into spoilers so that way I can have more to say within this review. So with that said, let's double five this bad boy up, because it's about that time to let heads roll, because it is spoiler time, it's about that time to get you spoil this movie. So, we go on in the very beginning of this film, we have Sung-ryung, who is to be walking to her home. We have a guy named Sung-ho who eventually is to drop Sung-ryung off. It seems that Sung-ryung is to somehow to have dropped her cell phone, and the guy is to be willing to give her his own cell, and she's like, no, I think I'll just install my landline. And he's like, okay, that sounds fine. So we have Sung Ho, who is to go on and mention the past, the people who had lived here before Sung did, and is to mention that I guess that these people who had lived here in the past were shamans and did witchcraft and all kinds of weird things. So, but it seems that this house was to be better than a lot of others. So Sung is to go on and install her landline and is to try to call her own phone. Come to find out, we have her people who had taken the cell phone answer this call, and it seems that they end up saying, hey, is there a reward for us giving you back your cell phone? And she, of course, is to be like, well, and they go on and they say, like, well, like, this seems to be like a really nice phone, and then they hang up. So Sung is to try to locate her phone, and she can't find it anywhere, so she's like, well, I guess there's that. So Sung all of a sudden is to answer this phone, and we have a girl named Jung-suk who is to mention that her mother is crazy consistently. Every time she answers, she just mentions that her mother is crazy, and she is trying to talk to a girl named Shin-hye. So, come to find out, Sung is to eventually start making her way through her home, and is to realize that eventually a portrait had fell, because I guess some nail like would keep falling out of this hole. So Sung goes on to eventually find out that this wall is to have something hidden behind it. So Sung breaks through the wall and is to realize that there is this whole stairwell that leads to this kind of underground room, oddly, that eventually leads to this diary / journal that Sung is to grab. So Sung is eventually getting another call from Jung-suk, mentioning again that her mother is crazy. And so Sung is to mention, like, hey, you're Jung-suk, right? Like I think that we both are living in the same house. And Jung-suk is like, what do you mean? And so eventually they find out that Sung is in this future, and that Jung-suk is in the 90s. She, of course, is in right around supposedly like I think the early or the later 90s, I think. So we go on, we have Sung, who is to talk to Jung-suk, and I guess after every single night of Jung-suk getting tortured by her mother, eventually Jung-suk is to talk with Sung, and they are to talk about the knowledge of the future. Sung is to find out that Jung-suk's favorite band is to be a band that has some future success where where the time period she lives in. And so Sung is to go on and have Jung-suk get all these cassettes to record every single new song that this band has. And so Sung is to have that kind of future knowledge and that future music. So we have Sung, who eventually is to tell Jung-suk about certain like phone information, about how eventually a cell phone could become a smartphone and can connect to the internet and everything, and some people can go on and do video calls, and Young Suk is like, "You're lying to me, right? You're making this up." And Soyoung is like, "No, it's the truth." So eventually, Soyoung is to hear that Young Suk is to be torn away from this phone by her mother to torture her yet again for another night. So eventually, Soyoung is to hang up the phone. So eventually, Young Suk is to hear from Soyoung that her father had got into a accident when she was little at the home that they lived, and that eventually Soyoung's mother is in the hospital. And so when Soyoung is to talk to her mother in the hospital, like it doesn't really seem like her mother is all that there. So we go on, and we we have it soon that that possibly her mother is going to die. And so Sayong is asking her mother, it's like, well, why are you even going on and painting your nails? Like, it feels like a waste because you're going to die soon from the illness of which that her mother has, which is kind of a very hard thing to just go on and say here, but it's the truth. So Sayong is to tell Young Suk about this. So Young Suk is to come to find out that her mother is also not only this witchcraft like person, this shaman, she's also to be this realtor. And so it seems like Young Suk's mother is to try and sell her own home. And so Young Suk's mother is to go on and showcase this whole house and off. And so Young Suk is to meet up with a young Sayong. And so Young Suk ends up calling Sayong to have her hear the voice of her own father. And Sayong is like, oh my god, like that's my dad. So Young Suk is to mention to Sayong now that Young Suk had met with young Sayong and her own father, that Young Suk is going to go on and try to prevent this accident that happened to Sayong's father. So we go on to have Young Suk, who goes on and walks, takes a bus to eventually get to where Sayong's parents live. And come to find out on that day, we have this pot that is left on this oven, and it is consistently continuing to flame, and that is supposedly the whole cause of this fire. So we have Young Suk, who is to adjust this oven and then is to leave without anybody knowing. And so all of a sudden, Young Suk is to tell Sayong that, hey, like I did it, like I saved your family. And so Sayong is to then have every bit of her home change, every part of this house drastically change, and all of a sudden Sayong is now wearing a completely different outfit in a completely different room, and is now going on to see that her parents are living with her here, and everything seems to be looking up. Sayong eventually is to spend so much time with her parents as they are gardening and so on and so forth. And so Sayong is to consistently lose track of time now being with her parents a lot more. So Young Suk is to be calling Sayong and saying like, hey, like I guess you finally remember that I call you, right? And Soyoung is like, oh, I'm sorry, like I've gotten so busy, like me and my parents, like we had so much to do, yada da da. So Young Suk is just like, okay, sure, like whatever. So Young Suk realizes that, like, oh, like you're having like you're blowing me off now. as Young Suk is every night to still go on and continue to get tortured, and there's nothing that she can do. So Young eventually is to finally look up Young Suk, as there was a temptation to do it once before, but Young Suk says no, like, with my past, like, I normally don't think that I have good luck. So Young is to go on and look up, of course, her past, Young Suk's past, to find out that at one part we do have Young Suk's mother who kills her own daughter, and it made the newspaper. So Young is to go on and tell Young Suk that tonight her mother is going to try and kill her. So get ready for eventually to try to prevent this. So Young Suk, who is to have consistently gone on and eaten dirt and plants to the point of her just being in agony with all of this, is to finally get what seems to be her revenge. So we go on and we have Young Suk's mother, who is to go on and have all these things that connect in a line, and Young Suk is to go in, or Young Suk's mother is to go in to her room and start stabbing away into this bed. She's like, yeah, I'm finally gonna just start like getting rid of this daughter, finally. So all of a sudden, we have Young Suk's mother who pulls away these bed sheets to find out that all these things are just stuffed animals. And Young Suk is from behind with his fire extinguisher to spray all into the room. And Young Suk's mother is to drop this knife. So Young Suk is to ask her own mother why she would go on and want to kill her. And Young Suk's mother tells her that she had read Young Suk's fortune, and Young Suk was to go on into the future and kill a number of people. So somehow or another, Young Suk's mother was to be the hero of this story to snuff this woman out. Oddly. So Young Suk, who is to now just be in this heckle of a laugh, is to now just go on and eventually go and stab and kill her mother and put her in a number of plastic bags. And instead of going on and like burying this girl in some part of the ground, no, this woman just goes on and puts all the pieces oddly in this refrigerator to have for safekeeping, oddly. It just seems weird to me. So we have Young Suk, who is to go on and tell Young that like she's fine, and then now she feels reborn. That doesn't sound good, right? Young Suk is to mention that she now feels reborn, and that she's gonna go off and start buying a bunch of clothes at these stores, probably a thrift store, because 90s, and Young is like wearing all these kind of like weird and goofy clothing that it doesn't feel quite like the 90s, but it is what it is. So it feels like she's getting like the 60s or the 70s kind of clothing. I guess they didn't really know what actual like decade they should be getting clothes from, so they just tried to get the earliest they possibly could, because these clothes look weird. So we have Young Suk, who eventually is to also go to this food joint and is to eat all of these like chicken wings, and she's like scarfing them down, just like licking the bones and all this stuff, because she is to eat actual food for the first time. And so Young Suk is to talk to Young and be like, yeah, like this is so great, like I no longer have my mother here. And Young Suk honestly could have chalked all of this up to really just be self-defense, but the longer and longer that we have Young Suk, who really just stacks up all of these body parts into this fridge kind of makes her look more of a murderer. So we go on and we have Sung-ryung, who eventually is home with her parents and is talking to this strawberry delivery guy. And so this strawberry delivery guy is dropping this stuff off, just being really nice. So all of a sudden we have this also going on in the past, where we have Sung-ho, who is to deliver these strawberries with much longer hair in the 90s to Young-suk. So Young-suk is to go on and mention that her mother is not home, and so this guy with the strawberries goes on and delivers this stuff anyways. All of a sudden, Sung-ho is to eventually go into this girl's refrigerator to drop off all these strawberries and realizes there's an unusual sack in this girl's refrigerator. And so eventually Sung-ho grabs this sack and it falls. And then when he goes and picks it up, he notices that there's a little hole in there that possibly has some fingers. Having Sung-ho realize that this girl had murdered someone. So we now have Sung-ho on the phone trying to call the police, and So Young answers it, and it's realized that it's Sung-ho, and he's like, oh my god, like, this girl had killed somebody, oh my god. And so all of a sudden Young-suk is to find out that this guy had figured this whole thing out, and so she's like, oh my god, now I have to go on and ruin my clothes. And so Young-suk is to go on and kill Sung-ho. And so now all of a sudden, Sung-young is to eventually ask her parents where is the strawberry delivery guy at, and they're like, oh, like, he's not here. Okay, so Sung-young is eventually opening this refrigerator door to realize all the strawberries are now gone, and she's like, okay, alright. So slowly but surely, So-young is to realize that Young-suk in the past is starting to kill people. So we now have to figure out exactly why Young-suk is to no longer be in this home, and so So-young is to have to figure that out also. So when we have So-young, who is talking to Young-suk and is to ask her about the strawberry delivery guy and what had happened to him, Young-suk is to go on and eventually tell this girl nothing or to make things up. And so So-young is to realize that this girl had killed. And so eventually So-young is to find out that somehow or another they were to track down Young-suk and eventually turn her in to the authorities, that eventually the cops had figured it out. So Young is to tell Young-suk to, like, try to turn herself in, because eventually they'll find her anyways. And so now we have Young-suk who's telling So-young that, like, well, no, like, you just tell me how they figured it out so I can reverse that in the past. And So-young is like, well, no, like, I'm now. So all of a sudden we have Young-suk, who is to have a young So-young and her father make their way to her house without them realizing it, without them realizing that this woman is a murderer. So we of course, go on and have So Young, who goes through her normal day to day, and she is now driving in this car with her father, that is to go on and try to show her how to drive. So all of a sudden, So Young is to make her way driving, and all of a sudden, while she's in this car in this tunnel, we then find out that So Young's father is to disappear right in front of her, to appear as these shards of glass, and everything that is around So Young is to be coming off as a number of shards of glass. And so So Young is to realize that this car, as well as her father, is to fade away, and So Young is just left in this tunnel in the middle of the road, just laying down by herself. And she is to now get up and make her way back to this landline to talk to Young Suk. So, come to find out, what had happened is that Young Suk was to kill So Young's father right in front of her. And then Young Suk was to tie a younger So Young down to this chair, and is to then go on and torture So Young to do what she wants, and to also tease the fact that Young Suk can go on and find this girl's mother and kill her also. So now things have picked up. Basically having So Young or Young Suk calling this girl all kinds of names and all kinds of things. So Young Suk is to want to know this information of how they catch her in the past. So So Young is to go on and deliver this story to Young Suk, that I guess there was some junk dealer that was to find this knife in this box, and that's what led to eventually this being all uncovered. So Young Suk goes to this junk dealer's place and is to wait supposedly till 5 o'clock for this guy to come in there. And So Young is to have this girl go to this place because the place ends up exploding, hoping that So Young is going to be not getting a phone call from Young Suk, because Young Suk is now dead from this explosion. So Young Suk instead is to go outside this building and to eventually be looking at these dogs. And eventually 5 o'clock passes, the whole entire place that Young Suk was in explodes, and Young Suk is eventually going to go on and get some burns from being nearby that happening. But so Young Suk ends up calling So Young, and is to get even with her if she is to have burns in the past, that So Young will have them in the past also. So we have Young Suk, who goes on and is to boil this water and is to start to pour this on So Young in the past. So So Young in the future is to feel all of these burns, and she is screaming in agony about it. So we have Young Suk, who is telling So Young, it's like, oh, so you're going to answer the phone every time that I call, right? Like, you're going to answer me, right? So we, of course, have So Young, who tells her the truth about how eventually all this was to actually happen. And so, and every time that Young Suk tries to prevent something, something else happens where eventually Young Suk is to be found out about. So because Young Suk is to eventually have these police officers who go to her house and are asking her questions. And Young Suk is to mention that her mother isn't here. And they're like, well, when will she be back? And Young Suk is like, oh, she'll be back later on. And they're like, oh, okay. So eventually, when Young Suk is to get rid of this knife, the next thing that ends up happening is Sung-ryung ends up breaking into these police records to then try to figure out how they had caught this girl, and she figures out how. So Young goes on and is to tell Young Suk what happens. Because eventually, we have So Young, who his mother is to go to this police station, and it's to say, it's like, well, it's kind of weird. My husband and my daughter, they they aren't home yet, and this seems very unusual. The last thing that I knew that they were going on and doing was going to Young Suk's house. And so, can you guys go and send some police over there to just kind of see what's going on? So Young explains to Young Suk what is all going to happen within this note that she is to read off. So we have Young Suk, who eventually is to have this police officer and So Young's mother here. And so what ends up happening is Young Suk, while talking to these people, Young Suk eventually goes on and just kills this officer. And then So Young's mother is kind of running through this place trying to grab onto this landline, and is to try to call the police. And so Young is to now be calling the younger version of her own mother. Young is to tell her mother, it's like, hey, this woman is going to kill you. Like, you gotta scramble and get out of here. Or you gotta figure out a way to, protect yourself. So Young's mother is to go into this room, and all that she can find is this fire extinguisher, because I'm sure Young Suk has socked up in a bunch of fire extinguishers throughout this house so she can continue to murder people, because that seems to be the thing that she keeps doing, is to keep on spraying people with these fire extinguishers and then killing them off afterwards. So Young Suk is to try to eventually use the sound of Young's mother's child to get Young's mother to come out of the room. And Young, the future Young, is hearing this. So eventually what happens is Young's mother is to battle with Young Suk. And everything in this house that Young is in continues to change. Eventually it continues to change to eventually be this more beat up house. And Young is eventually to have it change to there being a number of different weird looking refrigerators there, and a number of weird goofy things here. Because we find out that Young Suk is to not have gotten caught, because she is to be doing this so well and have this future knowledge from So Young to continue to help her out. So eventually So Young is to be in the same house where a future Young Suk is to try to go after So Young. And eventually So Young is eventually trapped in her own room, where Young Suk is to try to barrel her way in here, try to bash her way through this door. So eventually what happens in the past is So Young's mother is to take Young Suk and is to grab her and have them both fall from this location where a staircase is to be nearby, and they fall through this balcony to fall down onto the ground. And we have Jung-suk who disappears from the future. So we assume Jung-suk is dead, and so So-young is to go on and figure out whether or not that her mother is also dead. And so So-young is to go on and race off to the hospital, which her mother's not in the hospital. So-young is to race off to go to the graveyard where she is to spot that there is to be possibly a grave that has her mother's name in it. And all of a sudden, So-young's mother is to be at this graveyard and is talking to So-young and is telling her, "Hey, like, what are you doing here? Like, come on, clean yourself up." Like, so all of a sudden, So-young is realizing that her mother is still alive, and they end up walking off. Here's the thing, though. We have another part of this story where we have future Jung-suk who's talking to past Jung-suk and telling her that what is all possibly going to happen, and that future Jung-suk is going to tell past Jung-suk to eventually just vanish and to go into hiding, and so that eventually future Jung-suk can go on and eventually find future So-young and to get her and then grab her and nab her and then probably kill her off so Jung-suk can go on and still continue to not be caught, and eventually may lead to a sequel somehow or another, which I can't really believe that there would probably be a sequel out of this because it wouldn't make sense. To continue to talk, well, it would be kind of interesting to have like future murderer talking to past murderer. That might be an interesting way to just play things out, but I don't think that would be a good enough sequel. But anyways, with that said, that is the call from 2020. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about this movie. Let me know how you felt about the call in any way, shape, or form. Eventually, if you've known a number of other movies that are just like this, let me know in the comments below, because that would be cool. Because I'm sure there might have some point been a number of these kinds of movies that are to deal with phone calls, like when a stranger calls or something like that, that eventually has this kind of idea or concept or whatever. Let me know in the comments below. I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.